Beijing experienced its heaviest rainfall in 140 years. Against the heat waves that are wreaking havoc globally, what sparked the unprecedented weather events? And the next BRICS summit will kick off in South Africa. What's on the horizon for BRICS countries and those aspiring to join the emerging platform? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Beijing has experienced its heaviest rainfall in 140 years since records began. The downpours caused by Typhoon Doksuri have killed at least 20 people and affected some 600,000 people in the Chinese capital and neighboring Hebei province since Saturday night. The city issued the highest or red alert for floods on Monday and lifted it on Wednesday as the rain subsided. While floodwaters are receding, recovery work proves daunting. Chinese President Xi Jinping has demanded an all-out search and rescue effort in the aftermath of the disaster. The floods came on the heels of extreme heat waves which hit the Chinese capital and neighboring areas earlier this year. Against the heat waves that have wreaked havoc globally, what sparked the unprecedented weather events? Is there anything that can be done about it, and are there more to come before things gets better? I'm pleased to be joined from Guangzhou, southern China, by Qi Ye, professor at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, also professor at the School of Public Policy and Management of Tsinghua University, and from Queensland, Australia, by Professor Brendan Mackey, director of the Griffith Climate Action Beacon at Griffith University. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. First, about the torrential rain in Beijing. Professor Qi, now, Mengtogo district and Fangshan district in western Beijing are among the hardest hit areas. By August the 1st, across the city of 22 million, 11 people are confirmed dead and 27 people missing. How serious has the disaster been, and why is western northern Beijing particularly hard hit?
Well, to answer those two questions, we see this time around, it's a very, very serious time. And on the record, and in the last 143 years, this is the first time we have seen such a very heavy rain, and it's reported almost 1,000 millimeter for this time around. There's a 999.7 millimeter of rain in Hebei province, and more than 500 millimeters in Beijing.
What does that compare to the average?
Well, the average, this is in Beijing, somewhere between 500 millimeter to 600 millimeter per year. So we see the heaviest rainfall this time in just 4 days. It's just almost twice as much as the annual precipitation in the area. So that's how bad it is. And why this area in Fangshan district or in Beijing and Hebei area is hard hit this time. And this, as you just mentioned, this has to do, of course, with the Typhoon Doksuri. And but it's not only the typhoon. Typhoon happens every year, and the East Asian monsoon that comes from southeastern part of the ocean all the way to northwest. When it comes to Beijing and this area, it hit the mountains, the so-called the Taihang Mountain and the Yanshan Mountain, and then the humid air and will go up, then just make very heavy rain. This happens East monsoon, like I said, every year, but never had happened like this in record time.
Yeah. Professor Mackey, the heavy rain started Sunday until Wednesday morning, lasted 70 hours. Is Typhoon Doksuri the main culprit here, or how much of it is because of Doksuri and the strength of it?
Well, when you have a major flooding event, and may I say my commiserations to all the people who have lost loved ones in the flood, and all those people who have lost their homes and businesses. There's a real human dimension to these tragedies we have to keep in mind. So when you look at the impact of the flooding, that's due to, as Professor Xi said, this unprecedented intense rainfall, which exceeds the capacity of the watershed to safely shed the water. And so you get these flash flooding events and areas flood that have not flooded. The impact of that on people and settlements and infrastructure is due to the exposure of all of that to the flooding and the vulnerability of the people and the businesses. So the impact is a combination of the unprecedented intense rainfall and the exposure of the buildings and the people and the infrastructure to that event, and the vulnerability, the capacity of the people to mitigate the impacts of it.
So coming back to you, Professor Chi, and of course we share the sorrow for the missing and those who perished in neighboring Hebei province. And it is reported that in some places, in some locations, water rose by as much as 6 meters above their ground level, their normal levels. So Professor Chi, what is your take on the kind of preparedness or vulnerabilities of these places? From your knowledge, are people getting the kind of need and assistance they need in time?
I think in general, the early warning work has been done quite properly, because you mentioned that this time is already raised to the top level of early warning, but the prediction has been various. We have seen prediction of the rainfall from 250 to 500 to more than 800 millimeters from different places in different countries. And however, the forecast prediction and the forecast is not everything. The early warning is very, very important. We this time around, certainly, I think the government have learned the lessons from the 2012. The so-called July 21 incident in Beijing, and also the July 20th incident in Zhengzhou just a couple of years ago. And the early warning is done properly in my view. However, I mean, since nobody has experienced a severe flash flood and rainstorm like this before, I think this is it's very unfortunate that the action is much less than what is really needed to prevent the tragedy from happening. And this is also a big reminder that we are facing a climate that's really unprecedented, and we have to take a lot more seriously than we had before, facing this greatest threat to the humanity. The climate change.
Yeah, Professor Mackey, things may go even more unpredictable. That the intensity of flash floods or downpours may be stronger in the future. What could possibly be some of the good practices that can be learned, can be used by major metropolises like Beijing, which we cannot upgrade our capacity indefinitely, but what can be done? Any, best practices or suggestions?
Yeah. So what we need to be doing is taking a comprehensive approach to disaster management. And often when agencies and communities when agencies think about disaster management, they think about responding to an extreme event. But really there are 4 phases to disaster management, a comprehensive approach. The first is prevention. And that gets back to what we talked about exposure and vulnerability. Do not build new structures on floodplains, right? For example. So through good planning, you can avoid a lot of exposure. You can prevent a lot of harm. The second is preparedness. And this gets back to having better networks of flood gauge systems and better early warning systems.
Right.
and better logistics about getting people out of harm's way when the warnings come. The third is with the response, you really have to have really well connected up agency responses. You need many, many different agencies and services working together in a highly coordinated way. And that response has to be planned well ahead of time. And also in the recovery, often the response might be adequate, but communities and businesses and people, their lives and businesses are affected often for years afterwards. So a lot more effort has to be put into the recovery. So it's that comprehensive approach. It's called the 4 Ps, or the 2 Ps and the 2 Rs: prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery.
Well, hopefully a lesson will be carefully studied and learned from this disaster. But looking into the future, Professor Chi, from the perspective of global warming, as I said, Beijing has had extreme heat waves hitting the city particularly early this year and particularly strong this year. And then we're seeing heat waves in Europe, in the United States. Are we, again, looking at the different consequences of global warming that is getting worse?
Well, we are definitely looking at the consequences that are getting worse, but this year is a little different because this year it's marked the beginning of a new round of El Nino and southern oscillation, and that means on top of climate change, we say that's the gradual incremental change year by year. On top of that, then we have an additional layer of uncertainty and severity. And this will, in the past, we call this kind of event or climate extremes. But unfortunately, these extremes are becoming more and more common. And that's a new reality we must face. And therefore, we must have definitely enhanced preparedness and to prevent this kind of thing and exposure. And we can't really control the climate very much, but what we can do, as Professor Mackey just said, we can do that to 2 Ps and 2 Rs better, and to build a more adaptive city and more resilient city, and make the future loss and damages and less for the future. You just make it even more resilient city.
Well, the World Meteorological Organization has said that this July is said to be the hottest month in history. Professor Mackey, what does that mean for the global climate warming fight that we have been trying to step up? And what's the case of Australia, as people are predicting the chances of El Nino weather remain likely in the coming weeks? Are we going to see a higher intensity of El Nino because of worsening global warming?
Yes, and that's right. We are seeing global warming, and let's remind ourselves that this is human influenced climate change from us burning fossil fuels and producing these greenhouse gases, which is making the planet hotter, warmer, and that is resulting in disruption to our climate system. And as Professor Chi noted, an increase in the frequency and severity of these extreme weather events, both heavy rainfall day events, but also these heat waves. I mean, what we've seen in Europe and Mexico, Southern Europe and China have just been extraordinary. China had temperatures exceeding 50 degrees in northwest China. The all-China heat record was broken on the 16th of July in Sanbao. And we have a branch of science now, of climate science, called attribution science, which is able to attribute how much more likely a given event was, extreme event was, because of human-influenced climate change. So we know that these extreme events that have been occurring in South Asia are largely driven by climate change. Right. The extreme heat wave in China, you recently experienced would have been extremely rare without human influenced climate change. In terms of Australia, we had this situation 3 years ago. We were in the middle of a El Nino. We had the biggest, the longest drought we've ever experienced, the biggest bush wildfires we've ever experienced, and all heat waves were broken. So it's a very serious situation in terms of more people die from heat waves than any other extreme weather event.
Let's keep that in mind, unfortunately. Many thanks, Professor Chi and Professor Brandon Mackey. When we come back, the upcoming BRICS summit in South Africa shines a spotlight on the continent's development. What's on the table? Stay tuned.